are my sunlight. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Noirwich Crime Writing Festival 2020. The Noirwich Crime Writing Festival is a partnership between the National Centre for Writing and the University of East Anglia. A huge thank you to the Arts Council England and to this year's festival supporters, Dead Good Books and the Crime Vault for making this event possible. My name is Nathan Ashman, and I'm a lecturer in crime writing at the University of East Anglia, and it is my great pleasure to have the opportunity to introduce tonight's very special speaker, the award-winning US author and screenwriter, Attica Locke. Attica is the author of 5 acclaimed novels, including Pleasantville, which won the 2016 Harper Lee Prize for Legal Fiction and was longlisted for the Bailey's Women's Prize for Fiction, Blackwater Rising, which was nominated for an Edgar Award, The Cutting Season, a national bestseller and winner of the Ernest J. Gaines Award for Literary Excellence, and Bluebird Bluebird, a 2018 Edgar Award winner. She is also a television writer and producer, and most recently worked on Netflix's When They See Us, a portrayal of the 1990 wrongful conviction of 5 teenage boys from Harlem for a brutal attack in Central Park. She has also worked on an adaptation of Little Fires Everywhere for Amazon Prime. Connecting all of Attica's work to date is an insistence on laying bare the inequalities of power that lead both to violent crime and miscarriages of justice. From the mendacious and murderous petrochemical company in Blackwater Rising to the corrupt and broken local police force of Bluebird Bluebird, her work is concerned with crimes that extend beyond the purview of the individual, interrogating the deeper fault lines and discriminations that define the past and the present of the American South. Attica's most recent novel, Heaven, My Home, is an expertly crafted thriller mystery, one that not only offers a sharp examination of race, violence, and belonging in Trump-era America, but that also ruthlessly explores the traumatized underhistories of power and prejudice on which a nation has been built. Indeed, in the UK, The Guardian described it as a propulsive and compelling novel, one that balances elegiac evocations of Texas with powerful meditations on displacement, reconciliation, and forgiveness. Today, Attica will speak to us about crime fiction's responsibility to truthfully reflect the societies that we live in, and the ways in which, through writing, we can challenge the institutional structures, be they governments, police forces, or universities, that allow prejudice, injustice, and violence to proliferate. I will hand over to Attica very, very shortly, but just a quick note to say that this event will be followed by a live Q&A with myself and Attica, so do stay around after the end of the lecture. So without further ado, please everyone give a big, albeit virtual, round of applause for Attica Locke. Thank you.
Oh my word, I have to start with my absolute, total, and complete gratitude for being asked to share my thoughts about anything. I'm super flattered. And this is, I will admit, quite odd for me in a lot of ways. I don't normally, I'm not accustomed to sharing my thoughts outside of the pages of a book. I mean, I certainly mouth off on Twitter and I do so in interviews, but this whole experience is really asking something different of me. And it's asking me to, after 5 books, deeply kind of contemplate what I've set out to do in a way that has been unconscious in some ways. I think this has been a gift for me, for somebody to ask me to consider the scope of my work and its meaning and purpose. And forgive me for my eye line getting down. I've got lots of notes. But I want to say this. So what I've been asked to speak about is ostensibly to talk about crime writing and decolonization, which to my American ears, not that we don't have a history of colonizing, we certainly learned from the best of them. What I hear in that is a proposed subject matter to investigate crime fiction's ability to look at systems of power, to look at how crime stories and their characters do the work of kind of proposing change to systems of power or disrupting systems of power from both within and without, if only by elucidating how these power systems work, kind of pulling back the veil on forms of hidden power. And for this lecture, I would like to focus on one particular area in which power is asserted, power is horse-traded, it's shielded, and sometimes where how and where power is hidden. And I want to talk about this. It's going to sound strange, but go with me. I want to talk about real estate. Now, I'm somebody who, when people talk about my books, they bring up setting a lot. That setting is a huge part of my work and the worlds that I build. And what I want to extrapolate from that is to talk about land as power. because colonization obviously it began with the amassing of land in foreign nations, the theft of land. And in my own country, this country's history began with decades of theft of land from Native Americans, for whom there was no even concept of the land being anything but God-given, until people started to attack and were willing to kill them for it. So wars have been fought throughout the world over land. And in my contemporary novels, of course, what often happens is that the tangible bloody crimes at the center of the stories are almost always masking larger crimes about land use, land ownership, and the power that's bestowed by each. So yes, today I would like to talk about real estate. And I want to start by talking about how land use has been sitting in my psyche for decades without realizing it. So I've said many, many, many times, I come from a long line of Black Texans, that my family in Texas goes back generations all the way to slavery. I'm not sure how familiar a UK audience is with the concept of the Great Migration that happened in the 20th century, mostly in America, which was kind of like the largest migration of people within a nation's borders, certainly in American history. And if you want to know more about this, I can tell you, read this book, The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson. That is an illuminating book about this American phenomenon. She also has a new book out called Cast that I pre-ordered because I hear it's gonna be incredible and is gonna help a lot of people understand the time and place that we're in with Black Lives Matter and how we got here. So the thing about the Great Migration is that throughout the 20th century, certainly after the First and Second World Wars, Black folks fled the South. They fled in droves. They fled the constant threat of violence, the restrictions of segregation. They left behind limited economic opportunity. And they left behind this idea that after having served overseas in Europe and having been treated marginally different, the disrespect they got when they came home in uniform. They said, basta, we're out. And they fled north and west. They went to Chicago and New York and Newark, New Jersey, and of course, California. But my family stayed in the South. My family is the flip side of the Great Migration. We never left Texas. And I have, well, let me say that. I certainly had a few cousins that might have mouthed off to the wrong white person and then had to get on a train real quick. But other than that, we stayed. And as how do we get this land? We stayed because we had land, and that meant economic power. And how we got it is thus: it was a combination of homesteading and purchasing land in piecemeal. So during and after the Civil War in America, there were several homesteading laws that were passed. And the idea of this is that if you could find some land and nobody else was on it, and you claimed it and you did something to improve the land, you built a structure on it, you started a farm, you could then claim that land and own it. And these laws were passed before the Civil War, and after the Civil War, there was some explicit idea that this would help former slaves, that this would be a way for them to be self-sustaining citizens, to have land and all of this. And on my mom's side, my ancestors used this tool. My ancestors, through homesteading, started a freedmen's community after the Civil War called Nickton. Now, Nickton, I actually dedicate my novel, Heaven My Home, to Nickton. It is a freedmen's community like Hopetown. And let me slow down, be clear, Nickton is exactly what you think it is. They called it Niggertown. That's what the white folks called it. But for us, it was a self-sustaining town that was built, that was a church and a school and Black businesses, and also Native American folks were very much a part of Nickton. And so for us, you could call it whatever you wanted. For us, it was a home for my people, and it was a way that we launched ourselves. I'm talking about generations of doctors, lawyers, educators, and politicians. For us, land offered the possibility of economic ascent. And on my dad's side, as far as we can trace on his mom's side, is land that was given to my great-grandfather in a way that was quietly helped along by some white ancestors who were not publicly claiming they had this Black relative in the mix, but they found a way to cleverly, at a great discount, find a way for my great-grandfather to acquire land. At which my sister, who is our family historian, she's the one who's begun to really begin to figure this stuff out. So my grandfather had this land and he couldn't afford to get a big farm where you had the house and all of the acres there. So he would go around San Jacinto County and get little plots. And so he might have to drive 10, 15 miles between plots to farm cotton and corn. So this is the history of my family. And things I have to be honest, I didn't really deeply think about until I was in my 30s. And I had enough of an understanding of Texas and Texas history and the current political climate in Texas that hurt my feelings, that I just was not proud of. And I kept trying to think, wait a second now, why did we never leave? And I remember I wrote about this for Texas Monthly Magazine because they asked me to write an article about how to raise a Texan. And I was talking about my daughter and my history there. And I asked for that article. I asked my great aunt Altha, and I asked my grandmother Willie Jane, whom we call Precious. I asked her, why did you guys never leave? And what they both said is, well, Daddy had a little farm. And I'm going to read a little piece from Bluebird Bluebird where I write about having land, that Black folks didn't just up and leave that kind of wealth to start over somewhere foreign and cold. No, the Matthewses dug deeper into the soil, planting cotton and corn and the roots of a family that would be theirs alone, and not a pecuniary unit convertible to cash at will. They farmed hard and made enough to raise generations of men and women and send dozens of them to college and graduate school. They made a life that could rival what was possible in Chicago or Detroit or Gary, Indiana. They were not willing to cede an entire state to the hatred of a bunch of nut-scratching, tobacco-spitting crackers. Money allowed for that choice, sure it did, but money also demanded something of them, and the Matthewses were willing to give it. They built a colored school in Camilla, offered small business loans to colored folks when they could, and they dedicated their lives to public service, becoming teachers and country doctors and lawyers and agitators when the times called for it. What they were not going to be was run off. This passage is essentially my family's history. On both my mom's side and my dad's side, everybody comes from rural towns along Highway 59 in East Texas. And this, what I've just read, is the reason why we never left. And because of the ingenuity and hard work of my ancestors, I came into the world, if I'm being fair, with relative privilege. I come from landowning, educated people going back to Reconstruction. And the privilege is of being born a certain station in life, being a land-owning Black person, a Black Texan. I've also understood what our land and the fact of it has meant to white racists around us. People have been trying to steal my family's land since we got it, helped along by the fact that the irony of desegregation and the irony of more economic opportunity for Black folks in the cities, in Dallas and Houston and all these other places, is that folks left. Folks had this land deep in the country, but they wanted a good job at a high rise in Houston or Dallas, and that land that belonged to our grandparents and great grandparents just sat there, which allowed for local white folks to come in and steal it. Basically, when it was left sitting empty, when you couldn't keep an eye on it, basically you have people out there. This is my family's story. There are white folks out there who have forged documents, have forged signatures, who have moved property lines in their favor while we're trying to make a living in Houston. They've been doing this shit, and all local officials frequently will turn a blind eye. And I've grown up with these stories. I've watched my mom go toe to toe with these men in rural courthouses where they're saying, we can't help you, honey, because we have your grandmother's signature. Or my grandmother, my mom's signature, saying that she signed away a piece of land. My grandmother had a master's degree. She was a teacher. But how do we prove to these local officials that she could read that she never would have signed something with an X? There was one family whose land abuts my mom's side of the family, their land. They actually tried to, with moving the documents around, buy up a piece of land that made us have to trespass to get to our land. And all of this is happening in Texas with gun racks everywhere and Confederate flags and pickup trucks. And it's just, I say all this to say that somewhere in my mind, I was absorbing all of this from a child through college, through early adulthood. And that the idea of what land ownership means and what the fight over it means has been lying dormant in my psyche for years before I ever thought to write a book. And so when I think about that first book, well, I have to admit, you guys, I didn't know what I was doing. I was a newbie, I had no clue. And I also did not have an appreciation for the way in which the psyche and the unconscious mind really plays a part in writing books, that it's working in tandem with your conscious mind. So I thought I was going to write a slick little thriller. I wasn't thinking it was going to have anything political in it. What I had was a premise. And that premise was what opens the book. There is this incident that happens on a boat in Houston, Texas, 1981, on Buffalo Bayou. Jay Porter, our protagonist, goes out on a boat with his wife. When they get into a dark backside of a bad neighborhood, they hear a woman screaming for help, and then they hear gunshots. This is actually based on an incident that happened to our family. I was on a boat with my dad and my stepmom and many other people, and we had this incident happen, and our reaction to it was, call the police. I don't know what the hell's going on. And we did. But I thought, I could take that premise and I could insert a small-time criminal defense attorney who doesn't have a lot of money, who used to be an activist, who has all these scars from being an activist, and I could just write a slick thriller. But the book I ended up writing was better than the one I intended to write, because I allowed my unconscious mind to lead me to something else. Because on its face, that crime that opens the story, this murder, it seems isolated. But over the course of that book, when you start to learn the other storyline in the book, there's a longshoreman strike. There's a threat that these oil and gas workers will walk out in solidarity, which means oil for all of the nation, because most of it came out of Texas, would be shut down. And we'd be back in the 70s with the long lines and all this kind of stuff. When Jay starts to realize that that thing is connected to the action in the opening pages, he starts to put something together. He's caught between these two stories, and the way that he figures out the biggest crime in the book, which is not the murder that opens the pages, is because of a fraudulent real estate deal. Let me back up for a second and say something else about what I was saying about land and Houston. So Houston in 1981 was the darling economy of the globe. It was untouchable. It was in the middle of an oil boom. People were moving there from all over. This is when you get the movie Urban Cowboy, and you get Model Jerry Hall, and you get this Texas kind of culture, because it was just making money hand over fist, and it was growing too fast. It was growing so fast that it could not actually keep up with its growth and serve all of its citizens. In fact, I make a point that in the book, Jay lives in a predominantly Black neighborhood, which has sporadic trash pickup, to the point where there's an actual scene where he goes to take his trash out and it all kind of dumps down at his feet, because in a poor neighborhood, the city can't keep up. They don't have enough employees to pick up all the trash. But in rich neighborhoods and white neighborhoods, they hire their own private contractors to pick up their trash. So you're getting a picture of Houston as a place that puts growth in industry over how to best serve their citizens, how to improve their lives. And so that was always just a backdrop of the thing that I wanted to say. And even the fact that that initial crime on page 3 or whatever happens in a neighborhood called Fifth Ward, which is a Black neighborhood, which does not have a lot of resources, where somebody would not pay a ton of attention if a couple of gunshots went out in a single night. Somebody chose that to carry out a crime. And I wanted that to be a part of the story as well. The ways in which political and societal neglect frequently lead to criminality. The way that kind of plays a part. But getting back to this fraudulent land deal, and I'm sorry, you guys, there's gonna be some plot spoilers, but it's been out 11 years. I can't help you. It's been out. So what happens is the woman that Jay saves, the one who was screaming gunshots, when she gets saved, and Jay ultimately finds out she works for a fake real estate company, a real estate company that has no office. All they're doing is trying to very quickly buy up homes in a very particular neighborhood near a salt mine fast. And this is what ends up leading to the biggest crime of the book, is that when Jay follows that trail and realizes that why somebody's trying to scoop up all these homes really fast is because there's oil coming up in their backyards. That is revealing the bigger crime of the book, which is that an oil company has been illegally storing oil and hoarding it in a salt mine, which is a thing that is done in America. There's the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, the nation does it. But I was posing that this actual company, a corporation, is doing it so they can manipulate oil prices. All of that is discovered because one guy wouldn't sell his house. Like one guy says, this old guy, Erman Ainsley says, and I guess nobody would have figured any of this out if I'd sold. if I had sold my house, because he was a stubborn old man. And it allows Jay to ultimately take him on as a client. And you know that you go out of the book knowing that he's going to sue Coal Oil and is going to bring down the bigger crime. That, not that the loss of life at the beginning of the book is not important, but I frequently come back to the idea of street crimes masking bigger crimes. So when I think about my second book, The Cutting Season, which when I had second book syndrome and I was a new mom and I was terrified. But I will say that I don't think I've written anything that is more nakedly about land ownership and land use and the power they convey. I mean, the whole story starts because a dead body is is left on the wrong side of a property line. So that already sets it off. She's a migrant worker and she works for a big agricultural firm that works the sugarcane fields that surround this plantation, it's called the Bellevue Plantation. And in 2009, it's a historical tourism site. So, and I have to say this, they host weddings, they do tours for schools, they put on plays about antebellum life, and they have a gift shop. And I actually based this place on a real plantation called Oak Alley Plantation. And I invite anybody at any time to please Google an image of it. It is something to see. I went to a wedding there in 2004, and it was one of the oddest experiences of my life. I had never been on a plantation before. And in order to get there, we had to drive through, because it was about an hour outside of New Orleans. We had to drive through rural Black poverty in order to get to this plantation where these majestic columns just shot up along the Mississippi. And it was one of the most beautiful things I'd ever seen, which infuriated me. Because if you could draw a direct line from that plantation to all of the poverty we had just driven through. It was disturbing. And when we got there, when I finally stepped out of the car on the land, I burst into tears. I didn't understand, why am I here in a $300 dress and heels on a plantation? What is this? And why, in order to get to the main house where the wedding is, do I have to walk past a plaque which had the names of every slave and what they cost that had ever been on this plantation? The only thing that gave me peace was a sense of feeling like, okay, the bride and groom were actually an interracial couple. I'm in an interracial couple. My husband is white. The wedding was actually on our wedding anniversary, of all things. So I'm thinking, okay, I know what we're doing here. We are going to gather on this land that has represented racial violence and pain, and we are with love going to remake it, rethink it. I kept waiting all night for somebody to make a toast. Somebody say something about where we are. Nobody did. Not even the Black relatives. And the bride's father was a minister. I literally never known a Black minister who couldn't find a microphone and say something at a wedding, ever. He didn't say anything. So it became clear that the couple had simply picked this place, not for any sense of its history, but simply because it was stunning. And that is part of its, that's part of its cunning, and that's part of how you obfuscate history, is that you cling to the beauty of it and you simply wipe out. And this novel is about the people who own the plantation, who own that land, get to tell history or not tell it. I want to read, again, Google this up, see the pictures, but I do want to read a little passage that kind of paints this thing about the tangle with the beauty and everything else, because I have to say that to write this novel, I couldn't hate the plantation I was writing about. I actually had to believe it was beautiful. I had to also be seduced by it. So I'm going to read this passage from the opening of the book. It was during the Thompson-Delacroix wedding, Karen's first week on the job, that a cottonmouth, measuring the length of a Cadillac, fell some 20 feet from a live oak on the front lawn, landing like a coil of rope in the lap of the bride's future mother-in-law. It only briefly stopped the ceremony, this being Louisiana after all. Within minutes, an off-duty sheriff's deputy on the groom's side found a 12 gauge in the groundskeeper's shed and shot the thing dead. And after one of the cater waiters was kind enough to hose down the grass, the bride and groom moved on to their vows, staying on schedule for a planned kiss at sunset, the mighty Mississippi blowing a breeze through the line of stately 100-year-old trees. The uninvited guest certainly made for lively dinner conversation at the reception in the main hall. And by the time the servers were making their rounds with imported champagne, several men were lining up to have their pictures taken with the Viper before someone from parish services finally came to take it away. Still, Karen took it as a sign. A reminder really that Bellevue, its beauty, was not to be trusted. That beneath its loamy topsoil, the manicured gardens, the 2 centuries of breathtaking wealth and spectacle, lay a land both black and bitter, soft to the touch, but pressing in its power. She should have known that one day it would spit out what it no longer had use for, the secrets it would no longer keep. So, as I said, this book is about who owns the land that history sits on gets to decide how that history is told, or if it gets told at all. Karen is the descendant of slaves that worked on this plantation, and now she's the general property manager. And of course, she's initially caught up in this mystery, the crime of what happened to this migrant worker who works for this agricultural firm. But through trying to figure that out, she finds out, oh, wait a minute, that agricultural firm that's working these sugarcane fields, they want to buy the plantation, raise it, thereby even further erasing history and plant more sugarcane. For me, it's almost like it's a, and then of course, over the course of the book, Karen also realizes that her ancestors actually owned the land. I actually used the same thing without even realizing it, the same laws that my ancestors were able to use to say that her ancestors owned that land. So it's almost a Russian doll of obfuscating and obliterating history. You have a corporation that wants to raise a plantation that's been selling a fake version of history that actually belongs to the descendant of a slave. It's wild when you think about it. And the crimes in that book are many. And the death of that migrant worker is just the start. It's just the start of those crimes. And I do want to offer that there's been a lot of debate when I've spoken with people about this book, about the ending. People who don't like it. There plenty of people feel like the fact that Karen, when she finally confronts Raymond Clancy, whose family's owned this for generations, who stole it from her family, his ancestors, when she finally confronts him about it, she does not say that she's going to make a play for the land. And people have said that they didn't understand that at all. She says, hey, when Groveland buys this, I'm out. When everybody else has to leave, I'm going to. She says to Raymond Clancy, I don't want it. I don't want it any more than you do. And what she was saying is, I don't want the history either. We both got stuck with some shit we didn't ask for. And of course, I wrote those lines after Obama was elected. And I have to say that all of my books, I always have a dateline at the beginning. They are always meant to be fixed at a certain place in time. And so this book was very much inherently colored by that time. It takes place in 2009. I was writing it after he was elected. It is so much about my optimism that my country might be heading in a new direction. And it makes me think about some of the final lines in the book where after the plantation has been sold, all of the workers and the people who've been reenacting slave parts and have been working at these weddings, they know it, this is it. They have a final kind of party down at the slave quarters, and they know they're probably not going to see each other ever again. And I'm going to read this small passage. Lorraine was drinking beer from a can. She stood and said it was time to head back, to pick up where the catering crew had left off, bussing dishes, breaking down tables, cleaning the kitchen and any left behinds in the dining hall. But as Lorraine started to her feet, Karen asked her to please sit down. Leave it, Lorraine, she said, her tongue light with champagne, her mood brighter than it had been in weeks, years even. Leave it just as it is. Those words were me as the author expressing a hope that we could leave the tangled and ugly, violent and messy past of slavery to walk into something new in the Obama era. And it hurts me every time I have to admit how wrong I was. But that's not what happened. But that was written out of my optimism. You mentioned my third book, Pleasantville, which is about real estate and voting rights. It's about real estate and voting rights and how they came together in one Houston neighborhood and actually changed Texas history. Pleasantville is a real place in Houston. I grew up there, didn't know about it. I only learned about it because my father ran for mayor. My father ran for mayor of Houston in 2009. And I could not understand why there were so many campaign events in this little neighborhood, which basically had seen better days as far as I was concerned. It was not that great looking, and it was mostly middle class, working class Black folks. I just didn't get it. Why was every candidate for mayor and congressperson and governor, why were they all doing rallies there? I didn't understand. And then I asked somebody the history and knew I was about to write a book, because the history of Pleasantville is fascinating. There were these two Jewish developers in 1949 who just came up with this idea that if we had a Levittown over here and we had a Shaker Heights, Ohio over here, why couldn't we have a planned community for Black folks with money? This was a dream that they had, that they created. And so all of a sudden you had thousands of Black folks who had money. I mean, insurance was a big game for Black folks in segregation, but you know, they were bankers and lawyers and everything, and they had money, and they were buying these beautiful homes, and they were educated, and they were engaged. If you put them all in one place, you know what happens? You create a new voting precinct that is concentrated Black voting power. I don't know that those two developers were thinking about this, but that's what happened. And I actually opened that book with the epigraph that from the Houston Chronicle, it's a true quote, that every politician worth his salt knows the road to elected office passes through Pleasantville. You can't quite get elected in Houston without capturing that voting precinct. It's known for its political power, and it's always being courted. And the Pleasantville in that book, which takes place in 1996, was at a crossroads, was against the ropes, so to speak, which is another thing about land ownership and use. So it was built to sit among prairie land. It was just beautiful before. And but Jay, when he drives up into Pleasantville in the early pages of the book, there's a short quote. There's a way that he describes a tiny little patch of woods that is, I'm telling you, to find any patch of land in Houston that doesn't have some piece of industry on it is a shock. If Houston thought it could get 6 jobs out of this square 8 centimeter of land, they would build something on it. Like, it's just, that's the culture of the city, which raised me, I have to say. Anyway, Jay's, the narrator is saying about this patch of land, it's a rare block of undeveloped land in a city that wears its disdain for proper zoning as a badge. Its belief in industrial growth as democracy's birthright penciled in just behind the pursuit of happiness. Pleasantville in particular had become surrounded by industry over the last 20 years, ever since the 610 freeway was built against the residents' strident opposition. This is true of Pleasantville itself, that over the years, all of that prairie, I keep gesturing down here, nobody can see it. Over the years, all around Pleasantville, there were chemical plants and all kinds of things that got built around it on that prairie land. And some of it was with the residents' opposition. Once they lost the fight to have a freeway cut their neighborhood in half, they lost a lot of battles about this kind of stuff. But I have to also admit, they fell victim to the siren seduction of industry like anybody else. That is the culture of the city in which I was raised, which is industry first, people second. And so they got surrounded by chemical plants. And in 1995, the year before this book takes place, there was a humongous chemical explosion at a plant that burned down a good part of the neighborhood. And that was the beginning of the decline of Pleasantville. People started to leave. It was just terrible. And in my book, in the fiction, I have Jay Porter as their lawyer, that he's trying to put together a class action lawsuit against this company. And that is the reason why he gets drawn into a mayor's race that's going on, because there is a Pleasantville native running for mayor. And 2 things open the book. There's a girl who goes missing on the night of the election. She actually works for the other candidate, not the person from Pleasantville. And Jay Porter's office gets broken into same night. And these 2 are ultimately connected, because what that book is really about, even though it seems like it's about this missing girl, it's actually, when Jay digs into it, it's actually about a plot to completely reimagine how people campaign in America, how elections are won. So in America, it's all done by maps. It's done by, you look at precinct maps and you decide in American parlance, they're red or they're blue, they're Republican or they're Democrat. And the way that elections have been run is you are running for whatever, and you look at a map and you write off this neighborhood because they're Republican and I'm a Democrat. I'm not going to bother campaigning there. Or you look and say, I'm Republican and this neighborhood is blue, I'm not going to bother campaigning there. However, what Jay discovers is that somebody is trying to use the mayor's race in Houston as a test case for breaking this system up. For instead of writing off neighborhoods, you go in surgically into a neighborhood armed with information about every single resident, every single house, and you pull out the votes that you can use for yourself. And it destabilizes a voting bloc. I could not have written this book had I not read Victory Lab by Sasha Eisenberg. I learned about this from reading that book, and the fact that this was something that was in play ahead of George W. Bush's election in 2000. And what Jay figures out in that book is that that's what somebody is trying to do. They're actually trying to do a test case for how they'll run this shit in 2000. And in fact, Charlie Luckman, one of the characters, says the way about 1996, he says, the way elections are run, it's all changing. It's not precinct by precinct anymore, not for the ones who want to win. Because 4 years from now, it's all going to come down to a handful of votes, which is exactly what happened in 2000. So Pleasantville looks at real estate through the eyes of political power, and also how, in particular, Black voting power can be manipulated and diluted. And that is the real crime of the novel. And it's something that interests me, obviously, because my country's still dealing with it. We're still dealing with efforts to erode Black voting rights by redrawing district lines, by on campaign maps, putting fewer polling places in Black neighborhoods. This is a story where real estate becomes a political destiny, that if I live in a certain place, I can be targeted and my voting power be diluted. My fourth book, Bluebird Bluebird, kind of brings me back to where I started, because it's so deeply rooted in my Texas history and my Texas roots, and where my interest in land as a vehicle for telling stories about criminality kind of got started. In that book, there are these two back-to-back murders that take place in a tiny little town of Lark, a town that was actually itself once a plantation. It was owned by the ancestors of a character named Wallace Jefferson. And a parcel of that land had once been given to Geneva Sweet, a Black woman who opened a cafe along Highway 59 that was initially set up so that Black travelers on Highway 59 in East Texas, who had nowhere else they could stop or eat during segregation, they could stop there. And the significance of Highway 59 in East Texas, if you look at a map, it goes from Laredo, which is on the Mexican border, all the way along the east side of the state up to Texarkana, the Arkansas border. So for Black folks in East, and beyond that, it goes like up to Minnesota, Missouri, it goes. So if you were a Black person trying to get the hell out of Dodge, if you were of the people of the Great Migration trying to get out, you would go on Highway 59. That's the way you would go. And so I'm gonna read a tiny passage that kind of sets up the importance of Geneva's place. It had been born of an idea that colored folks who couldn't stop anywhere else in the country, well, they could stop here. They could get a good meal, a little bite off a bottle of whiskey if they knew how to be quiet about it. That you could get your hair cleaned and up before you made it to family up north, or to the job you hoped would still be there by the time you got on the other side of Arkansas, because there was no point in going if you weren't going to get way the hell past Arkansas. 40 some odd years after the death of Jim Crow, and not much had changed. Geneva's was as preserved in time as the yellowing calendars on the cafe's walls. She was a constant along a highway that was forever carrying people past her. And that was probably me trying to talk about the stasis of my family staying in one place as many other Black Texans left and went up the highway. And in fact, Geneva's, it only exists because of the moral crime of segregation. And her cafe is based on one that my great-grandmother had in Corrigan, Texas. It was also on 59. It was also a place where Black folks knew how to stop, because, you know, to the degree that a UK audience is familiar with the difficulty of traveling and traversing when you can't stop to pee or eat or sleep. That's the reason for the Green Book. And of course, there was a movie, The Green Book. We'll leave that. We'll just leave that. But the point is, there was an actual Green Book that let people know where they could stop, and it would. And my great grandmother's cafe was one of these places where people could go. They knew they would be respected and they would be safe. In Lark, so I said Geneva's exists because of the moral crimes of segregation. Lark exists because of the moral crime of slavery, because it was a plantation. And then the roots of that history run so deep that the town is still on its surface quite segregated, but it's actually entangled emotionally and genetically. That never gets really deeply exposed. And when you get deep into the case, what you find out is, of these two murders, that the motive for the first one is connected to the motive of the first one, which led to the second murder. The motive is land. It has to do with the fact that Wally Jefferson wants the land that Geneva's Cafe sits on, the land that used to be a part of his family, their portfolio, so to speak. And his father gave a piece to Geneva because at one point Geneva and Wally's dad were romantically entangled. What Wally wants is to get back what he believes is his. He wants his birthright. But the land, in my opinion, is an avatar for Geneva herself. What he wants is to possess her because he has arguably romantic feelings for her. So the land becomes this reclaiming and repossessing the land as a way to claim and possess Geneva, which is also a fantasy way of going back in time where I could just own folks. I owned everything here and I owned all of the land. And before I leave the talk about Bluebird Bluebird, I have to say that there's another story in here about land getting mixed up and mistaken for love. I get asked a lot about the character Belle, who is Darren Matthews' mother, whom I adore. I think she's just fun to write. She's crazy and she's fun to write, but I have compassion for her. And what I want to say about that is that when I started this whole lecture talking about the relative privilege of being Black landowning folks, there's the other side of it, which is Black folks who stayed because they did not have money. So I say it in the book, in Bluebird Bluebird, that the Matthewses stayed because they had money, but Darren's mother's people stayed because they didn't have the economic resources to flee. They didn't have money for a bus ticket. They didn't have money to get set up in a new city. And so for Belle, her psyche is set up by the fact that she believed that if Darren's father hadn't died, that if he had married her before he died, that she would have had access to that family's farm and the middle-class respectability that goes with it. And she wouldn't be renting a trailer on the back of somebody else's property. And that resentment, that resentment and the way that gets mixed up with love and what you owe me, my son, is why she torments the fuck out of him for 2 books. And it's all about, if I could have been on that land, I would have been seen as a respectable woman. I would have had something. And so I just say that to say that I frequently talk about crime fiction as being, in addition to everything I'm saying here, it being about the illusion of scarcity. That it has the ability to lay bare the sickness in the idea that there's not enough. That there's not enough land, there's not enough love, there's not enough food, there's not enough money. I want and you got, so I'm gonna do something violent to take it. And believing in scarcity makes you sick. It makes you do crazy things like I gotta take this and I gotta take that, and if I gotta knife somebody to do it, I will. But the truth is there is enough. It is a sickness to live in my country right now and say, we can't save the Postal Service, or we can't pay people while they can't work. While all of it's crazy, while there's so much being spent on military and so much, there is enough if everybody shifts their priorities. But when we live in a world in which scarcity is portrayed as bare fact, that there simply isn't. And in my country, 100%, we don't have, socialized medicine. We don't have, a national healthcare. There's just always this system that you are struggling constantly. Even Trump is trying to attack our Social Security right now. Like, so when you live in a world where there's not enough, then if you see a Mexican walk over the border, you're like, no, your ass can't come in because I don't even have enough. Get the fuck out. That's where all of this kind of sickness and violent thinking, in my opinion, comes from. So I'll move on to talk a little bit about Heaven My Home. And I'm not gonna do any spoilers here because it's new. I'm gonna try not to do any spoilers, but this book also so nakedly turns on land ownership. And it brings us back to what I said earlier about how my country was formed, which is by stealing land. The original crime of America is stealing land from Native Americans. And the book takes place around this area, Caddo Lake in East Texas, which is, please, another one I want you to Google. You have to see it to kind of understand it. It's huge. And it actually is so big that it crosses state lines. It's just magnificent and crazy. And so the book takes place around Caddo Lake in a real town, the real town of Jefferson, which is another place that a lot of its industry is built around replaying the past and rewriting the past. And also the fictitious town of Hopetown, which I, was modeled on Nickton and of course dedicated Heaven My Home to Nickton. So it's a freedmen's community out there that's on its last legs. It's down to one black man and a few Caddo Indians. And here's the thing you really have to understand, that Texas was named by Caddo Indians. The Caddo word for friend, ally, is Texas, which became Tejas, which became Texas. If there is anybody who can lay claim to Texas, it is them. It is them and the other Native American tribes that were here long before anybody else was. But of course, Texas's history is rife with wars and battles and whose land is whose. Mexico was in it, Spain was in it, France tried to get in it, and then ultimately white Americans and European descendants tried to lay claim to it too. But in my opinion, the state's soul belongs to Native Americans. I do want to read from a particular passage about the land and the lake itself that speaks to the breadth of its history. Because when you go deep into Caddo Lake, you go to a place beyond time. You can't even hear anything in there because there's all this Spanish moss on the trees that actually sucks up the sound. So it's like you are riding through prehistoric times. So this is Darren Matthews and people riding through a cypress tree forest. It was raw beauty, floating through a forest of trees older than time itself. Trees that seemed to stand sentinel against outsiders, against any man or woman who didn't respect the lake's history, who didn't respect or understand what had been here before any of them on that boat had been born, before America was even an idea, before Mexico and Spain had a piece of it, before the French tried it too, and before Texas was more than a word of kindness on a Caddo's lips, Texas. In that novel, I love it so much. Sorry, I'm having a moment. I just remember how hard it was to write it and what it was to research it and go out on Caddo Lake with my dad, who did it because I was scared to be out there by myself. In the novel, there is the story of a boy who goes missing is actually masking a bigger fight over land, the land on which Hopetown sits. And part of the problem starts with the fact that this little kid who's named Levi King is the son of white supremacists who are squatting on Hopetown. So you've got Hopetown, which, like I said about the freedmen's community and other black land, that with other economic opportunity, what had started as these concentrated places of black culture and black wealth and our own city halls and all this kind of stuff, when you had access somewhere else or economic opportunity somewhere else, people left. And then there are a lot of these freedmen's towns still left in Texas, and they all have like about 3 people in them. The biggest one I've heard is maybe 12. And so in Hopetown, there's one guy left and a family of native Texans, the Caddos, that are there too. And all of a sudden, these white supremacists come and start squatting on this land, which of course is a metaphor. That's a metaphor for white folks coming in the first place and squatting on people's land. It's crazy. And so there's so many literal and moral crimes that are roiling beneath the story before it even fucking begins. This kid goes missing and Darren is sent there to putatively investigate this potential crime. Like, is this little kid missing or has some kind of harm befallen him? But he's also been instructed to use the case of this missing boy to dig up dirt on the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas. I won't say too much because then I want to talk about, I really want to protect spoilers, but know that what is the fate of this child hangs on a land deal. I'll just say that and leave it at that. And I will say just personally about that book and about that story. And this is not about land. This is me telling my feelings about how much that story is about me trying to know whether or not I could forgive the people who voted for Donald Trump. The book is very much about forgiveness. It's a theme that runs through every element of the book, because I'm quite aware that Trump will one day be gone. He'll either drop dead or he'll be voted out, or one or the other gotta happen. And then how do we all still live together? I still have to live, I still have to stand in line at the grocery store behind maybe people who put someone in office who disregarded the value of my life and the lives of millions of people like me because of the economy. What? And I have such rage for the ways in which they have untangled and threatened a nation to act out whatever kind of resentment they were feeling about this very thing that I talk about, the illusion of scarcity. That if I have to share this nation with new people coming in, then I'll just burn the shit to the ground, which is kind of what it feels like happened. That if you were being asked to acknowledge you didn't do all this shit by yourself, it was Black folks that built stuff, it was Irish people who came in, it was Chinese people who came in, who built railroads, who built everything. You didn't, it was no great white man of history that did this. If you have to acknowledge that, and also to acknowledge that this country doesn't belong to anybody truly but the Native Americans, who also didn't think it belonged to them, that it didn't belong to anybody. There was no sense of ownership. Unless you want to kill me about it, then I guess I'm gonna have to come back and work this out. But I say all this to say that I feel like we're in the place that we're in because people did not want to share this land, that people did not want to acknowledge the breadth of resources that are here for everybody. There's enough for everybody. And I guess what I want to say and kind of closing all of this out is the fact that I feel like I'm grateful to everybody here because you guys have kind of given me a gift to take the time to slow down and actually think about more deeply about the things I've written about in a more conscious way, what they mean, why they matter to me, I hope they matter to other people. And it's very clear that I come honestly by this fascination with the ways in which fights over land are really fights over political power. It wasn't probably until deep into my fourth book that I figured that out, or even maybe then when you asked me to write this lecture that I figured out, oh, a lot of the stuff I come back to real estate over and over and over again. And I always kind of start with this bigger crime that's masking something, or rather I start with the small street crime that's masking something bigger. And in my opinion, this is where we go wrong in the ways in which we discourse and dialogue about street crime. Because what I can't abide by, and I think why you saw everybody take to the streets this summer, is I can't abide by the fact that George Floyd would lose his life over passing a counterfeit bill. This is the pettiest shit ever. This is petty street crime. Or that Eric Garner would lose his life over illegally selling cigarettes. When there are any number of larger moral and literal crimes that set either of these men on a path to petty crime. And I'm talking about the fact that, and not that any of this ever should have cost them their lives, ever. But there are things that were set in motion that put them on a path towards behavior, towards petty crime. And all of that is about property use. It's about land use. It's about, when you look at things like in America, our schools are funded by property taxes. So guess what? If I live in a poor neighborhood, am I getting educated? The fact that police funding gets a portion by neighborhood. So some people are more likely to be over-policed and have more scrutiny. Some people are not. That's about land use and how you think about land. And also in our country, there's this history of redlining. There's this history of banks drawing big circles around Black, brown, or poor neighborhoods and saying, we're not going to fund anything. We're not going to fund businesses. We're not going to help with home loans. That then curtails African-American economic ascent. It puts a cap on what we're able to do, and it suppresses economic growth. We are always so quick to bring down the hammer on street crime, which frankly is 99% of the time people scratching out of survival. They're just trying to fucking live. While larger corporate and political criminals get away with murder. And I mean that both figuratively and literally. And for all of this, my hope is that what I leave you guys with, what I think about every time I sit down to write a book is this: always, always look for the crime behind the crime.
Thank you so much, Attica. That was absolutely fantastic. It was a real pleasure and absolutely fascinating to hear you speak about all your novels and particularly this aspect of land grabbing and ownership. It was really fascinating. And I have read Attica's latest novel and it's absolutely fantastic. So do please go out and get a copy. It's great. So just to remind everyone that we will be going into a live Q&A now, so do stick around and we'll have some questions with Attica. Great. Thank you so much again, Attica. That was fantastic.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. Thank you.
Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome again to Noirwich 2020. I just want to start by saying a huge thank you once again to Attica for delivering such a thought-provoking and engaging lecture. I'm delighted that she's joining us now for this live Q&A. So for those of you at home, if you would like to ask a question to Attica, then log into your YouTube account, pop a question underneath the video in the comment section, and I'll try and work through as many as I can in the next 30 minutes or so. So, as mentioned in her talk, Attica's latest novel is Heaven is My Home, the second novel to feature Texas Ranger Darren Matthews. And first of all, I mean, congratulations, what a great novel. It really kind of stuck with me afterwards, and I was thinking about it for ages after. And it's a story that starts with a kidnapping and ends up being about so much more. It's this kind of small crime concealing the kind of bigger crimes like you mentioned in your talk. You know, we think it's a kidnapping, then it ends up being corruption, greed, environmental racism, all of these things. So I guess the first thing I wanted to ask you was what brought you to this particular story? What was it about this story that you felt you needed to tell?
Well, it started for me with place, which happens for me a lot, the setting. When I knew I wanted to do this book series of stories along Highway 59, Caddo Lake was like it was like top 3 places I had to write about, because and I encourage people to look up images of it. It's so evocative and so specific and interesting, and the history. And so I knew I wanted to write about that place. The other stuff, I think, I knew I wanted to include the native Texans, the native Indians, and I knew I wanted to write about a freedmen's community. But I have to say that I was very unconscious during a lot of coming up with the story. And it was only after the book came out that I realized where that little boy came from. My daughter, so I live in Southern California. It is noon here. The sky looks terrible because of the fires here. And when my daughter was about 10, I'm trying to get the time right, it was around Trump's election. She goes to a very Southern California, hippy dippy, you know, we're all buddies, we are all politically left kind of school. And I thought that she was insulated from certain things until a young white kid at the school, this is like 5th or 6th grade, called a Black student the N-word. And I was stunned that this was happening in California in 2015. What is going on? And it was a wound for me in a lot of ways. And we talked about it at the dinner table lots, my husband, my daughter, and I. Because what happened is that my daughter was willing to forgive this kid in a way that I was not. She said, I feel sorry for him. I don't know what's going on there, but something's up. Whereas I was like, excuse my language, fuck that kid and fuck that kid's family. I don't have anything to do with these people. But then over time, I started to realize that it didn't feel good to me to be an adult holding a child to an absolute standard, and that I was projecting onto this child the way I had felt at 10 when I got called that word, and the way that, for me, there was violence associated with it. I actually at around that age was called that word by a friend and shot with a BB gun. And all of this was roiling in my heart. And so I was holding it against this kid. And so the theme of forgiveness in the book, and this question about, can you look to the next generation to fix where we are? That kid embodied all that. Levi King embodied, like, can we find him and save him? Became, can we stop perpetuating racial thought and racial violence? That's really where it came from. And I didn't know any of this until I finished the book. I didn't realize it. That's, my unconscious mind is a better writer than my conscious mind.
And this boy, this Levi King, you know, he's the son of an incarcerated white supremacist. And at one point in the text, Darren says of Levi, quote, his life was a precarious one, like a toy ball tottering on a wire fence. It could go either way. And I wanted to ask you to what extent Levi becomes symbolic also of a nation at large, of a country at crossroads in the wake of the election of Trump.
You're going to make me start crying.
Sorry.
No, because you're right. And we are at a, I don't actually have words to express how frightened I am, how much we are living presently in a constitutional crisis in America. The President of the United States has his Justice Department representing him in a rape case. what? It's over. I mean, it's crickets for America. It's done for us. If we don't fix this shit soon, this has all been smoke and mirrors, and it's all going to go away. So I am terrified about what's coming for us, because that is an apt way of thinking about it. And I hadn't thought about it before, but I'm really hoping, I think when I look back on these Darren Matthews books, they're going to always be representative of the Trump era. I did not mean it to be that way. I never thought he would get elected, first of all, but they're a snapshot of a moment in time. And so I think what you're saying is quite true. There being some kind of hopefulness in here that we can get out of this.
Yeah, I sense that, but Darren is struggling with that, isn't he? First of all, he can't forgive the father, but he's trying not to let that kind of judge his opinion of the son, that the son still could be something different. But I'll move to some audience questions in a second, but one last one from myself, which is one of the most fascinating things that I found in this book is the struggle between Darren's identity as a Black Texan and his profession as a Texas Ranger. In other words, here we have this proud Texas Ranger, one who seems to believe in the value of law enforcement, but at the same time is continually hamstrung by the prejudicial ideologies of the institution that he's proud to represent. And the impact that this has on Darren over the text, was this something that you were always interested in exploring between law enforcement and his racial identity?
Yes, because when I first came up with the idea for this book series that was this love letter to East Texas, where all of my family's from, I didn't have the character of Darren. I just knew I wanted to tell stories in these little towns. And my agent said, well, if you're going to do a series, people kind of they want to see a character that they're going to stick with. And I had to think of, well, who would that be? I mean, Highway 59 goes from Laredo on the Mexican border all the way to Arkansas. Who moves that much? Like, is it a lawyer? Is it a PI? And then, of course, obviously, it was a ranger. Their job is literally to range. So when I knew I had to write a cop, I had to go to a place within myself to figure out how to do that. And I read a book called Ghetto Side by Joe Leovi, and that had a big impact on me. And because there's a Black cop in that book, and that book predates language like Black Lives Matter, but that's essentially what he's saying. He is saying that I police in the Black neighborhood where I live, so that when crimes against Black people happen, I'm there to make sure somebody gets caught and somebody gets prosecuted. And so that was always there. And also the split in Darren's psyche that's represented by his twin uncles. Once that popped in my brain, I knew I could write Darren, because I feel that too. I'm split between wanting to love America and wanting to believe that the laws apply to everybody and that the law is the way that's going to fix the country. And I'm also the person who is terrified that that's not going to happen, that you can't trust the law, because one more time, the Justice Department of the United States of America is representing the president in a rape case.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, it's actually, I was just thinking about a section in the book actually where he realizes that it's the fight, that the nobility is in the fight, and that this kind of police aspect of him comes through in the end over law, because it's the fight that's in him. I was going to quickly go to some questions from the audience. I don't want to take too much time on my own questions. So we have one from Tracy, first of all, which is, you talked about a little bit there actually with Darren, but where are your characters drawn from? Do they come from specific reference points, or do they come to you fully formed, or do you figure them out as you write them?
I have a vague sense of who they are. The ones I think about the most are obviously the main characters. I spent a ton of time thinking about Darren, thinking about his life's trajectory. I spent a lot of time thinking about his uncles. I spent a lot of time thinking about his mom. But then something happens where when you get into the writing itself, Jane Smiley, the Pulitzer Prize winning writer, in her book, 13 Ways of Looking at the Novel, talks about the fact that writing is writing, not planning, that you can have an idea of who these people are going to be. But once I sit and write, an example I'll give to you is that I kind of knew Darren's mother, but the second my fingers, I got to do it up here because you can't see it down here. The second I start typing and I put her on the steps of a trailer, picking toenail polish off her toe while drinking a beer, I was like, oh, I know her. Yeah, I got her now. Like, right. It's behavior just pops in my head. And for the tertiary characters, they come out the most fully formed in the writing itself. Like when I had Rosemary King, come out with her clothes disheveled with her lawyer in her big colonial house. I kind of knew her. And so for me, I find them through their behavior, but I don't know how to explain how the behavior pops into my head. I don't know, other than the unconscious is a beautiful thing and I owe it everything.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, actually, it links to another question that someone had, which is about your process of drafting and editing. I mean, are you a rigorous drafter and a rigorous editor, or do you kind of work on sentences as you go, that so when it's finished, it's kind of fully formed, or how do you write? What's your process?
I have a analogy that I use a lot, which is writing being like carpentry, meaning if I were going to build a table, I would not try to decorate it and make it look pretty if it only had 3 legs, because it won't stand up. So for me, the story has to stand up, and then I'll go back and make it pretty. The only times that I go back are when something occurs to me that alters the story. And then I literally will circle back to page 1 and thread in this new thing I need to thread in. But for me, I don't worry so much about lyrical perfection or any kind of perfection until it stands up by itself. Sure. And then I can kind of get in there. But I do a lot of circling back.
So the scaffolding has to be there before you can kind of
very much so. And in fact, if there's something wrong with the scaffolding, I can't go forward.
Sure.
I have to go back.
Mm-hmm. Great. One here from Nicole Barbosa, who says, "Hello, my fellow Texan."
Oh, Nicole! Nicole and I have a little love affair.
She says, "Your beautiful book, Bluebird Bluebird, takes its name from a John Lee Hooker song. When you sit down to write, how much does music inspire and move you?"
Tremendously. Music, I almost cannot write without it. It is a heart opener for me. To the point where there have been times in my life where music is such a heart opener. When I lost somebody very dear in my life once, I could not listen to music for 6 months at all. I could not hear any music because it would just make me weep and collapse. So whenever I start working, I create a playlist for every book, and I pick songs that feel that they're just going to get me where I think I need to go, and they all sound a little bit different. There's overlap. And what happens is it becomes Pavlovian. Every time you sit down to work on that book, you put on that playlist. What starts to happen is once the playlist comes on, you kind of are halfway there. Like you got to kind of get into it faster. Even to the point where if there's a song on my playlist and my husband plays it like while we're eating dinner, I'm like, turn it off. I can't. That's work music. Like I can't take it. But music is a huge part of my life. Blues is a huge part of my life. There's just something about its truth telling, its sly humor, its bone weariness, and sometimes its hope that I so love about that art form.
And it can, a reference to a song in a novel can speak for itself so much, can't it? What you're trying to say through a reference to a song or through music, and that really does have a central place in Bluebird Bluebird, doesn't it? You have the musician who abandons his dreams to set up with in that roadside bar. It's great. Okay, we'll go to a question here from Nina. "Hello, mighty Attica. How do you use your writing to reclaim land and identity for the dispossessed? And why do you think it's more urgent than ever to reframe the narrative of land in America?"
Well, number one, I don't, it's hard to see myself as an activist or any, I mean, I'm trying to write good stories that also make people think. And that's the best I think I have to offer. I think the best thing that my work could ever do would be to shine a light on the ways that people are committing crimes in broad daylight, and the ways in which, in particular, and again, I never even thought about this till you guys asked me to write a lecture. And so I was like, I don't have any idea what I'm going to talk about, no clue. And then it kind of came to me that there's this through line in what I do around land, because it is a lot of the ways in which people get screwed. It's a lot of the ways in which people get screwed, and they don't always know that it's happening to them, or it's so easy to get focused on what people are doing on a street corner and not looking at what the Senate is doing with, or what local state senates are doing with redistricting lines, taking, polling places out of Black neighborhoods. Like, the best I can do is shine a light on it. And obviously as a citizen, do my part to vote, to during this election, people are sending postcards to citizens all over the country because, I live in such a left state that is politically progressive. For me to make a difference, I really have to reach out to people in other swing states or whatever. So I feel like I'm not answering the question.
No,
I don't think of myself as that powerful, frankly.
It's an interesting point. One of the questions I noted down as well, Attica, was about, when I've read about your work in literary criticism, you seem to be aligned quite recently with particularly things like Blackwater Rising, with a kind of an ecological crime writing kind of movement. And, that seems to me like what you're saying is those things are happening almost implicitly or unconsciously rather than you, but kind of trying to make an activist point about the uses of oil or that kind of thing, right?
Yes. And again, this lecture has been a gift to me to even slow down enough to think about these things. And it wasn't until Bluebird that I even thought about, I guess that's one of writing's gifts for the writer, is that you begin to realize, I never thought deeply about what it meant to be a Texan going back to slavery, or what it meant to have land during Reconstruction and how that has shaped the trajectory of my life. And it's a gift to write these things because they educate you. You get educated about the larger world by starting with your own family in a lot of ways. And I'm just, it's funny because I don't want to say too much, but I've been thinking about the next book in the series, and ecology is a thing that's been playing up, and it's impossible not to be. I'm literally looking outside and it looks insane.
Right. Yeah.
So it's impossible not to be thinking about issues of how do I put this? I think the pandemic has just pulled I hope for a lot of people there's a big shift coming. It's just pulled back the veil on the truth of capitalism being just fucking bullshit. Like, it's just really not good. Like, there's just a lot of things about capitalism that don't fucking work. And here, when you see people sending people back out to work, go make our shoes and go sell our this and go process these chickens, they don't give a shit about these people's lives. And you start to realize the moral depravity at the core of American capitalism. This sounds so, but it's the truth. I mean, it's
yeah.
And I feel that way about the environment, and I feel that way. Not to say anything about my beloved hometown, Houston, but I'm gonna tell you what, Houston loves a dollar, and they have a great economy, but they will not think 20 years ahead. And it is a city that has made all of its money through ecological craziness. I mean, they're the oil, the petrochemical stuff, all of it. But it's because a dollar now is prioritized over life 30 years from now. And that is very problematic.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, crime fiction is a vehicle to explore power. I think one of the things about crime fiction is that historically it's sometimes seen as a conservative genre. It's sometimes seen as a genre that's been quite a white genre as well historically. But Henry Sutton asks, to what extent can crime fiction enable democracy and actually break down or interrogate structures of power as well? Do you think crime fiction is an important vehicle for this kind of thing?
I think all fiction is, to be honest with you. I'm going to quote, I'm such a huge fan of Jane Smiley's and of that book, 13 Ways of Looking at the Novel. In that book, she says that it is the most democratic art form, fiction, novels. Not only democratic in terms of practicing it as a writer, all you need is a pencil and a piece of paper. You have free books in a library to study, but it is also the most democratic art form because it is the only one that lets you sit inside the psyche of another human being. And when you're inside the psyche of that human being, if that book is about a butler or about a king, nobody's inner life is prioritized over somebody else's inner life. And so I think all fiction has the capacity to be, how do I put it before? It grows the heart. I think all fiction grows the heart. And I do think that crime fiction in particular grows the mind about inequality.
Yeah, I would agree.
I do think it has that ability.
I would agree with that. We have a question from Emma here who wants to know about the different processes when it comes to, for instance, writing a novel as opposed to writing for TV. Is that a different discipline for you? Was that a kind of difficult adjustment or quite an easy one?
It's an easy adjustment in the sense that they're so different that you could never mix them up. When you write television, you gather with a team to do it. You don't really do it on your own. And you sit in a room for 8 hours a day, talking through story, trying to figure out what you're trying to say. You together as a team arc out the entire season of a show, and then you break that down into bits. But every piece of it is done collectively until you get assigned a script, and then you go off on your own and write an outline, and then you go off on your own and write the script. But it's so made of the team that, you know, there are pieces of it that are so specifically you. And if you have a really good boss, like I did, Liz Tigelaar, who was our executive producer on Little Fires Everywhere, was an incredible boss in terms of being able to say, here's my vision for it, but here's all the ways I want to hear what you guys have to say. I remember in my episode of Little Fires Everywhere, which was the 4th episode, I think, Pearl goes over to Elena's house to spend the night or something. And all the moms of color, there was a Korean mom and there were 2 Black moms. We were all like, so Mia's going to go get her kid, right? And Liz was like, no, I mean, she's going to spend the night. We're like, no, there's no mom of color that is not driving the fuck over there and telling her kid to get with her. And Liz listened. And so, you know, when you have a good boss, you get these parts of yourselves that are in the script, but it's such a team effort. I have said before that writing a novel is the most emotionally transformative, most fulfilling as a human being, as an artist thing to do, but television is the most fun. Just pure unadulterated. I'm laughing, just you get close to people. It's kind of like a dinner party. I mean, you have deadlines and stuff, but you just sit and talk.
That sounds great. So we have a question here actually from Serena, who I think is picking up on your discussion of the Plantation that was now being used as a wedding venue and a museum and a gift shop and all that other kind of strange stuff. She asks, you know, you mentioned in the talk that you could see how people would be seduced by that, and almost yourself felt seduced by the beauty of it. And did you feel a sense of guilt around that? And perhaps could you speak to that a little bit?
Yes. When I first laid eyes on it, we all stayed in New Orleans, and we were bused to this wedding. The bride and groom had chartered a bus, and so we ride through like abject Black poverty to get out in the middle of nowhere, and then all of a sudden, along Google Oak Alley.
Yeah, I've seen it. It's
this
bizarre.
thing shoots up out of nowhere, and it was so stunning. I literally gasped. And then I felt rage. I was so angry. And the thing I keep trying to compare it to is like, it's like a Jewish person listening to Wagner. Like you both hear the beauty in it, but you're mad and you're angry and you're mad that it's happening to you when you don't want it to happen to you. So I did feel anger, and I felt odd. I felt so many feelings. I felt angry with myself. I felt angry with the people who had the wedding there. I felt sad. I felt gratitude for the lives that have been lost on that plantation that made my life not literally possible, but I felt gratitude. When I went back to research that book and stayed at the Oak Alley plantation where the wedding was, and I stayed in one of their cabins. It was not a slave cabin, it was a bed and breakfast cabin. And I stayed there. And one night I sat out on my first night there, I sat out on the front screened in porch, and the sugarcane fields were like right kind of next to the cottage. And there was a storm coming in that night. So there was wind blowing through the cane leaves, and it kind of sounded like voices. And I remember feeling on the other side of Obama, sitting there on a plantation, feeling like I was with my ancestors. And I said, thank you. Your labor has not been in vain. It was an awesome feeling in 2009 to be sitting there. And it is directly proportional to how terrible I feel in 2016, that I truly thought that something permanent was happening.
Absolutely, yeah. We've got about 5 minutes left, so I'll ask, and I want to pick up on that point you've just made there at the end. So I'll ask a couple more quick questions from the audience. So I think one again is about how you write. So Austin asks, the street crime that masks the bigger oil fraud. How do you plan your reveal of this mystery? Do you plan your suspense, or do you prefer to write inspirationally and I guess improvise the kind of suspense?
That is preferable. My first 3 books, I did not outline. Not only did I not outline, I didn't even know who did it when I started. I just kind of started. That's probably why the first 3 books are so long too, because I was figuring it out as I went along. But I like to just feel my way through, because the best type of writing for me feels like reading. So I kind of don't really want to know everything, or else, I will say with Bluebird Bluebird and Heaven My Home, I actually did outline those, not all the way through, but I wanted them to be tight. I remember when I talked about this with the publisher, I kept saying tightly coiled rural noir. So I didn't want 400-page books. I wanted them to feel tight. So then I tried to have a lot more control over it by outlining. But even still, the way that I work is I just start and I get about 50 pages in. And then I go, oh, I don't really know what's going to happen. I don't know what to do.
Yeah, what have I got here?
I stop and I got to think it through. But I love to just begin on the atmosphere, the feeling, all that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that really resonated with me from your talk, and is something that Serena's picked up here, is this idea of the illusion of scarcity in relation to American politics and America right now. And Serena asks, to what extent do you think that this illusion of scarcity is actually fueled by greed? The two are kind of completely related. Do you think that the two things are completely connected, that greed and this illusion of scarcity, that greed on one end creates an illusion of scarcity on the other?
Yes, meaning this. When I think about a certain group of white folks in America bitching about immigrants, and they're going to take this and they're going to take that, that is coming from a place because you're not getting shit from your government. That's why you feel like there's not enough, because you don't have shit. And the reason you don't have shit is because up at the top, everybody's operating from a place of greed. So I do think there's a top-down thing that with the Mitch McConnells of the world, that shit is just greed. That's just pure avarice, sociopathic greed. But what it does is it puts pressure on people down below to make you feel like there's not enough. That there's not enough. I can't have these social services because all this other stuff with pharmaceuticals or the military, whatever, that the decisions that are being made up top make people who are just living regular working people lives feel like they don't have enough, that their government doesn't have enough to take care of them and protect them. I mean, you're talking about a country that thinks it's abominable that you would have national health care. Like just a basic human right. I mean, it's just, it's crazy. It's crazy. And I think that it makes people small-minded, and people don't want to share when they feel like what little bit they have is being threatened.
Absolutely. Yeah, I completely agree with that. And it's actually, I think there's a lot of resonances between the US and the UK at the moment. I think with Brexit and the Conservative government as well, it certainly resonates with me anyway. We're running out of time, but I did want to ask you one last question, which you mentioned just then, and actually you mentioned in your lecture that Pleasantville to some extent was a reflection of the optimism born out of the Obama administration. And I can certainly see that. But I also did feel that even in this book, that there is still some optimism at the end. And do you feel that this is an optimistic book after everything that happens? Do you still feel that there is some optimism in Heaven My Home, or is it a book that's just rage fueled?
Yes, optimism. I have to think about it. The truth of the matter is I can't fucking help myself. I'm sorry for person. I can't help me. I fundamentally have an optimistic, that's just my setting. On a 1 to 10, I'm about an 8.5 all the time. I will tell you 2020 is really made it difficult to feel very optimistic. But I think if I can't have any optimism and hope about a child, then I don't know what we're all doing here. So, and I think there is a way in which, and it's so funny, the things that sounded like really radical about my book when it first came out about, there's this one section about, what a handful of scared white folks could do to a nation. They just fucking lit a match to it, that if they had to share it, nobody's going to have it. That sounded real radical about a year ago. Right now, it sounds like, yes, it makes sense in some ways. So there's also the hope that Trump will just do himself in, and that the ways in which that Heaven My Home in sections asks people to contemplate what set us on this path. Maybe contemplating that can get us off of it. Maybe that's part of how, if I didn't have optimism, Nathan, I would not be on this Zoom. I would be prostrate on my bed right now. I have to have some sense of there's something hopeful coming. I don't know.
I think I knew, and I totally feel that in your books. It did strike me reading this one compared to Pleasantville that it felt much angrier, but I didn't leave it feeling that it was a pessimistic book. It still felt to me that there is these kind of green shoots of optimism looking forward. Right, we're out of time, Attica, but I just want to say thank you so much, first of all, for the lecture. It was brilliant, and for the excellent Q&A as well. And thank you to all your questions, for all your questions from the people on YouTube. Just to say that Attica's books are available to buy from Gerald's online and in store. And just to ask everyone to give a virtual, sorry, Attica, go. I thought I want
to say something. This has been like such an honor.
No,
I think that anybody would want to listen to me talk for this long. And honestly, this festival gave me a gift, because it asked me to sit and contemplate why I do the things that I do, and I'm very appreciative for that.
Well, thank you so much for sharing. It's been absolutely fantastic to hear from you. And as I said, if you want to get a copy of Attica's books, they're available online and from Gerald's in store. It's really, really fantastic. So do pick up a copy. But in the meantime, a virtual round of applause for Attica, and thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, guys. Thank you so much. Thank you.